HMS Furious is a curious case. A ship that was, by most metrics, a complete and total failure in her intended role. Such a failure, in fact, that even before completion, she would be modified away from it. Too lightly built and in the weird position of being both undergunned and overgunned at the same time. Furious was a ship that would have been the next best thing to useless as a gunfighter, so the decision to turn her into a testbed for aircraft carrier operations was very much the correct one to make once she was already confirmed to be completed. As it would turn out, Furious would see a long and fruitful career. Not a truly glamorous career, but the kind of work that needed to be done anyway. Not that that stopped her from beating on the Germans a fair bit in the Second World War. Of course, before her planes would beat on the Germans in the Second World War, she was designed and built to use guns to beat on the Germans in the First World War. Her origins are similar to her half-sisters in the Courageous class in this regard. Furious was designed and built as a wink-wink moment towards the British government by one Jackie Fisher. They weren't battlecruisers, they were large, light cruisers. This was largely down to the British government forbidding additional capital ship construction at the time of design. Without the ability to legally build more battlecruisers, you see the Courageous class come in as a way to get around that regulation. The result would be ships that were built incredibly lightly, just as lightly armored, and equipped with only 2 main battery turrets. In the case of the first 2 ships, 2 twin 15-inch turrets. This made them somewhat akin to a lighter armed and armored version of Renown. Furious, well, in her initial design, Furious took it a step further. She retained the idea of 2 turrets for the main battery. Only instead of the 15-inch gun that was quickly becoming Royal Navy standard, Furious would be equipped with 2 18-inch guns in single turrets. While I can respect the idea of bigger and bigger guns, within reason, this was a questionable decision. One that was recognized as such, even at the time, by the men expected to actually fight with them. Leaving aside the relatively slow firing rate of 1-ish round a minute, Furious only had the 2 guns. 2 guns that fired fairly slowly. This would have made hitting a moving target questionable at best, considering it would have been very difficult to track fall of shot. A third issue would come when Furious would test fire the gun she actually received. The Courageous class were, as previously stated, built very lightly. So lightly that even the more standard pair had issues with warping in their hulls, as well as, more pertinently, issues when firing their big guns. These issues may or may not have been overblown, sources differ on that, but there is no denying that the guns shook the ships heavily. Furious took those issues and amplified them, the overpressure causing serious concerns of damage to her hull. Though, it must be said, sources differ on exactly how bad it was, just like with her half-sisters. In the event, Furious would only receive the single gun, being completed with a rudimentary hangar and flight deck in place of her bow turret. And it is here where the design history ends and the service history begins. So let's see how Furious fared, shall we? Laid down on June 8th, 1915, and launched on August 18th of 1916, HMS Furious was quick to move from keel laying to launching, especially when, as mentioned, her design was pretty radically altered in the process. As designed, Furious would have had the previously mentioned pair of 18-inch guns. These were to be supported by 11 5.5-inch guns, in addition to a pair of 3-inch guns for anti-aircraft work, and 2 21-inch torpedo tubes. When commissioned, of course, Furious only had the one big gun, though she did retain her secondary battery. Her displacement, upon completion, was 19,513 tons at normal load, and 22,890 at deep load. With 18 boilers providing 90,000 shaft horsepower, Furious could get that hull up to 31.5 knots on 4 screws. Not bad by any means, especially for 1917. Though her speed would decline as low as 29 knots, with 30 being her usual top speed after her final conversion. As it would turn out though, none of her weapons really mattered to her career. What mattered for Furious and the future of British naval aviation in general was the flying off deck and rudimentary hangar fitted to her bow. So rudimentary that she had no such thing as an elevator, simply having a hatch that aircraft could be lifted out of by crane. Moreover, while his 160-foot flight deck allowed for takeoff, landing was another issue entirely. Furious was, at this stage, envisioned to operate with the fleet. Her 10 or so aircraft would be launched from her deck, but they would then be recovered by dedicated seaplane carriers later on. She was too valuable to slow down and recover planes, or so the idea went. Luckily for British naval aviation, one squadron commander Edwin Dunning came into the picture. This man was Furious's first aviation officer and had already been involved with early experiments in, still theoretical at that point, carrier flying operations. Dunning, supported by his commanding officer, decided to try landing on the ship. He wanted to see if landing on Furious was possible, and from there, how it could be used in actual operations. If landing on a ship at sea was possible, well, Furious could operate her planes repeatedly instead of launching them off and waiting for replacements or recoveries from the water. Proper naval aviation, not one-and-done launches. The problem would be fairly obvious, though, in that Furious not only had a small deck, but also her superstructure in the way. It would be one thing landing on her short flight deck if she were a flush deck design. It was another thing entirely when a pilot had to first circle around her superstructure, fighting wind and turbulence all the way, and then come in for a safe landing with no safety equipment. These were the days before such things as arrestor wires were even a twinkle in the eyes of naval engineers, at least as we understand them. So, with this in mind, Dunning and his fellow officers came up with a plan. They would take a Sopwith Pup, a light and generally forgiving plane, and attempt a landing on Furious. Dunning would do the deed himself on August 2nd, 1917. He took advantage of Furious steaming along at about 26 knots into a 21-knot headwind. The combination of these factors created a wind over her deck of about 47 knots. A Sopwith Pup's landing speed, on average, was about 40 miles per hour. The result of this? As he came in on a landing approach from Furious's port side, Dunning's plane functionally hovered over the middle of her deck when he reached that position. The Pup's landing speed against the headwind holding it in place. By repeatedly flicking his engine on and off, Dunning landed gently on the hangar roof at the widest point of Furious's deck. Men promptly swarmed his little plane to hold it in place as he completed the first landing on Furious, the world's first proper carrier landing. Of course, not the first landing on a ship in general, but the first proper carrier landing. Unfortunately, Dunning would attempt to replicate his feat on August 7th and perish in the process. His plane would lose power at the worst moments, and the wind would lift it off the side of the ship. Dunning was knocked out on impact with the water and drowned in his seat. Regardless, his actions showed the way forward, while also demonstrating just how difficult such a landing process really was. While Furious would initially serve with her sisters in the 1st Cruiser Squadron after this test, that would prove short-lived and see no actual combat for her. The experiments on landing upon her forward deck had gotten the attention of the Admiralty. Furious would, as such, return to dock in November of 1917 to have her questionable stern turret removed and another flight deck built aft of her superstructure. Her pilots complained bitterly about this, rightfully pointing out that wind effect and turbulence from her superstructure, not even talking about exhaust smoke, would make landing incredibly dangerous, especially in planes that were already lightweight and had demonstrated themselves as at the mercy of the wind. Of course, it was also dangerous to swing around her bridge to land on the front of the ship, so pick your poison here. That being said, Furious's first rebuild was based on the design worked up for the cruiser HMS Vindictive, which would actually complete after Furious did. The legacy of that compromise for speed of conversion, though, was the retaining of her bridge work and regular funnel. The Royal Navy was already looking at a full-deck carrier in the form of HMS Argus, but it was difficult enough pulling Furious off the line for a relatively minor rebuild, so she would have to wait for that. When she came out, the ship was starting to look more like a proper aircraft carrier, if still a weird one. She had a nearly 300-foot long landing deck aft of her superstructure, complete with an aft hangar and elevator. An electric elevator, in fact, with the hatch on her bow deck being replaced by a hydraulic lift for direct comparison between the types. The hydraulic one was, probably unsurprisingly, the more reliable of the two. To connect her two decks, a pair of 11-foot wide trackways were built along either side of her bridge. Aircraft with their wings folded could be pushed along these tracks to move between either deck. As well as this, there was a door for seaplanes at the aft end of the ship. With that, Furious could operate planes even at anchor. Unfortunately, operating aircraft at speed was more problematic. Landings were attempted, but 10 out of the 13 tests ended with crashes. Furious would, as such, operate as a takeoff-only carrier. Though, admittedly, her extra aft carrying space meant she could carry more planes. Recommissioned in this design on March 15, 1918, she would see fairly limited service for the remainder of the Great War. Limited in scope and number of actions, but not in their impact on later history. Furious would, on July 19, 1918, launch the first air raid from a proper, well, mostly proper, aircraft carrier. 7 Sopwith Camels would participate in the Tondern raid. In this, the planes would, albeit at the cost of all 7 to various causes, destroy 2 German Zeppelins, as well as damaging their sheds. This would turn out to be Furious's only major action of the war, though it was a sign of things to come for carrier aviation. After the end of the war, then, Furious would spend some time with the Royal Navy in support of White Russian actions in that civil war, before being placed in reserve in 1919. She would remain in that state until, in 1921, she went in for her second rebuild, and a far more substantial one at that. Her existing superstructure was cut down entirely, and she was, between 1921 and 1925, rebuilt as a flush-deck carrier. This was based on experience with Argus and the very new conversion of HMS Eagle, and Furious came out as a proper aircraft carrier, is still a rather inefficient one. This could be seen in her double hangar design, a legacy of being built as a flush-deck carrier. Specifically, she vented her exhaust through trunking it along the length of the hangar deck before it came out at the aft end of her flight deck. This system took up enough space that it was decided to fit her with a larger second hangar lower down in the hull. The compromise to fit both hangars was that neither would be taller than 15 feet. That would potentially cause issues with operating larger aircraft, though, as it would turn out, Furious was largely out of service before that became the issue it was on the later armored carriers. Another quirk of her conversion, shared with her half-sisters, was having her initial flying off deck retained for fighters. This did, in her initial service, allow for faster cycling of such planes. It would, however, become largely useless as planes grew larger and heavier. A flaw, to be sure, though not a crippling one. In the end, Furious came out of her first major rebuild as a full and proper aircraft carrier, capable of operating some 36 aircraft. This made her more capable than the other initial British carriers, Argus, Hermes, Eagle, but not exactly as good as some other carriers. Notably, the Lexingtons would prove to be quite better in American service. Still, considering the twists and turns to get her here, Furious was quite good enough for what she needed to do, which, for the 1920s, and even the 1930s, would largely consist of testing just about every aircraft the Royal Navy saw fit for carrier service. From testing float planes on her lower flight deck, to the first night landing on a carrier. That being on May 6, 1926, when a Blackburn Dart landed aboard Furious. These tests and experiments would help shape British naval aviation at a time when everyone operating carriers was still learning the ropes. It was a good thing for Furious to do, though by no means did it mean she wasn't capable of combat actions if it came down to that. She was used as an experimental testing ship, but she was still a fully capable warship. After a short overhaul in 1930, she would continue on similar missions, sailing between the Atlantic and the Mediterranean. until the tail end of the 1930s anyway, when her role changed again. By 1937, she was a training carrier, performing these duties until 1939, at which point Furious received a more extensive refit. This saw her old 5.5-inch guns removed and replaced by anti-aircraft guns, including on her now largely useless lower flight deck. The most striking visual change in this refit would be the addition of a small island on her starboard side. This was fitted to improve gunnery and flying control, and is the easiest way to tell when a picture of Furious was taken. Even after this refit, though, Furious remained on training duties. She would continue doing such roles, in fact, until World War II, and maybe would have continued on even at that point. She was very much not the best British carrier, with Ark Royal, the armored carriers, and even her half-sisters in service. But, well, both of her half-sisters would be sunk shortly after the war kicked off. After Courageous was sunk on September 17, 1939, Furious took her place in the home fleet. While she remained largely on anti-submarine warfare duty for the start of the war, she would also spend time hunting for German raiders in October. Fortunately for her, Furious left Scapa Flow on such a search on October 13th. The next day, HMS Royal Oak would be torpedoed by U-47. Furious, prior to leaving, had been moored right next to HMS Royal Oak. Lucky break for the carrier, one can say, though definitely not for the battleship. She would spend the rest of 1939 on similar hunting missions, barring a break in December to escort a convoy carrying the Canadian 1st Infantry Division to Britain. After this would come the Norwegian campaign, which was definitely a bit of a mess. Here, her remaining half-sister, Glorious, would be sunk by German battleship gunfire, making her the unfortunate case of a fleet carrier being gunned down by surface warships. This also left Furious as the last of the large light cruisers turned carriers. She would spend most of her time off Norway bombing either German troops in support of British and Norwegian soldiers, or, when they withdrew, attacking shipping. These were largely unsuccessful operations, mostly down to some truly foul weather. A prime example, unfortunately, is the Second Battle of Narvik, where Furious's swordfish did little, and most of the action was carried on the back of Warspite and British destroyers. She would eventually leave the area in mid-April, arriving in port on April 16, 1940, with all of 27% of her fuel storage remaining. In spite of her general lack of success with that, Furious would at least survive the campaign, which is more than can be said for a lot of ships, like again her half-sister. This is probably a good thing, even beyond the general attrition of British carriers in the early war, because in one of her more interesting roles, Furious would carry £18 million worth of gold to Halifax on June 14, 1940. On the return trip, Furious began her long career as an aircraft ferry, carrying some 40 mixed Wildcats and Buffaloes to Britain. She would spend one more stint off the Norwegian coast at this point, before returning to Britain and really getting into the aircraft transport business. In fact, she would spend the end of 1940, beginning in November, and most of 1941 on various ferry trips. She would carry Spitfires and Hurricanes to first West Africa and then Gibraltar. Eventually, she would graduate from this to directly launching planes towards the embattled island of Malta. During this process, Furious was bombed at Belfast during a refit in early May 1941, though this would do little real damage. Furious would, in turn, do little real damage when she took a break from the transport role to return to her Norwegian stomping grounds in July. As it would turn out, very little shipping was around for Furious, joined by Victorious, to actually hit. With her time off Norway done again, she would take one more ferry trip to Gibraltar before setting off across the Atlantic once more. Furious had been worked hard those first years of the war, steaming all over the Atlantic and Mediterranean. Her old machinery desperately needed a proper refit, and with British shipyards fairly overworked at this point, she would instead go to Philadelphia. She would have her power plant looked over and be fitted with some shiny new 20mm cannon, among other things, in this refit. Furious arrived on October 7th and would return to Britain in April of 1942, by which point it was a very different war, with the United States now properly involved. Before that really took effect, though, Furious would have more ferry missions for Malta. First, Operation Pedestal in early August, where she hung back from the main convoy battle and launched her Spitfires from further out. Then some more Spitfires following that operation. After that came Operation Torch. This was in November of 1942, and Furious was designated air support for the Central Task Force. In this, her Seafires would strafe French airfields. One of her planes would even manage, on the morning of November 8th, to shoot down a French fighter. Another first for Furious here, in that this was the first air-to-air victory for a Seafire. As a general rule, though, Operation Torch wouldn't see a huge amount of air combat for Furious to participate in. As such, after sticking around North Africa with Force H for a bit, Furious would return home for another refit. Rejoining the home fleet in February of 1943, after completion of that refit, she sailed for Norwegian waters once again, this time to distract from the upcoming Operation Husky, the invasion of Sicily, by playing decoy and letting herself get spotted. Luckily for Furious, she didn't take any damage playing decoy. Following a further refit, note how many times she requires this, by the way, Furious would spend the rest of 1943 on training duty. Come 1944, she would be back in service with the home fleet and back to bombing Norway. This time with a very specific target in mind instead of just sailing up and down the coast. That elusive target of British air raids, the battleship Tirpitz. In this, Furious would join Victorious once again, going so far as to exchange squadrons to train them in working together. This would pay off when, on April 3, 1944, the British planes hit Tirpitz when she was getting underway. This caught the Germans by surprise, and the British were able to score multiple bomb hits on the battleship. Which sounds more impressive than it really is, because the bombs were dropped too low to penetrate the German battleship's armored deck. It absolutely ravaged her superstructure and wrecked her upper hull, but it didn't do lasting damage. If nothing else, her machinery remained entirely intact. Still, Tirpitz would be under repair for months, which was a victory in of itself. Furious would take another swing at Tirpitz in Operation Mascot on July 17th. Her Barracudas, laden with heavy bomb loads, required a special expedient to get themselves airborne. One quite familiar to the Royal Navy of the Cold War, I suppose. A ski jump. Well, more accurately, a wooden ramp that was temporarily built at the end of her flight deck. Nonetheless, the concept was the same. It was a ramp to help planes that couldn't otherwise make it off her deck into the air. Unfortunately for all that innovation, Tirpitz was properly forewarned this time, and the attack failed. Further attacks over the course of August would, similarly, fail to do much. Alas, at this point, Furious was really showing her age. Remember how many refits she's gone through? All of those were bandages. Furious was fundamentally a ship of the Great War, and a lightly built one at that. She had been worked hard for the entire war, on top of her interwar service, and she was just plain tired and worn out. Coupled with increasing limitations on her outdated and small design, like the aforementioned need for a ski jump, and it would be no surprise that she was pulled from service. She would be placed in reserve on September 25th, 1944, and then paid off in April of 1945. She was used as a test dummy for aircraft explosives at that point, before eventually being sold for scrap in 1948. Furious had a long and, well, if it wasn't the most famous of careers, it was certainly a fruitful one. Not many ships can claim as many firsts as Furious, and certainly one can't deny that for a ship as questionable as her initial design was, the British managed to get their money out of her, even if it required a few steps to get to where she needed to be. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and I'll see you in the next one.